Man, let me tell you something. I was on vacation with Sam one time, Samuel Jackson. We was in Portofino. We had finished dinner one time. We walking back to go get on this boat.
I hear y'all take vacations together on the yacht or something.
Well, we get on the boat with Magic and Cookie. Steve and Marjorie have their own boat.
One of the most respected, most feared, most untouchable men in Hollywood just made it crystal clear. He wants absolutely nothing to do with Steve Harvey. And the way he did it? Cold, calculated, no apology, no softening of the blow, just a straight-up, on-camera correction that sent shockwaves through the internet and made millions of people stop and ask, what exactly does Samuel L. Jackson know about Steve Harvey that we don't? Because here's the thing. Samuel L. Jackson doesn't do drama. He doesn't do gossip. He doesn't waste his breath correcting tabloid nonsense. This is a man who has been in over 100 films, who built one of the most legendary careers in the history of Hollywood, who commands respect just by walking into a room. So when a man like that goes out of his way, on camera, publicly, in front of an interviewer, to make sure people understand he and Steve Harvey are not friends and never were, you need to pay attention, because that's not an accident. That's a message. And once you understand the full story, the stolen jokes, what allegedly happened to Bernie Mac, and Steve's silence while his stepdaughter was deep in Diddy's world, you will never look at Steve Harvey the same way again, and you'll understand completely why Samuel L. Jackson is done. Stay with me, because this one goes deep. The yacht correction that started everything. Let's go back to where this publicly exploded, the yacht photos. A few years ago, pictures started circulating online of Samuel L. Jackson, his wife LaTanya Richardson, Steve Harvey, Marjorie Harvey, Magic Johnson and Cookie Johnson all together on a luxury yacht in Portofino, Italy.
The basketball legend embarked on an extravagant summer vacation through Italy this past week and brought some of his famous friends along for the trip of a lifetime.
And the internet did exactly what the internet does. It went crazy. Celebrity squad goals. Samuel and Steve living their best life. The Black elite vacationing together. The headlines wrote themselves. Fans loved it. Everyone assumed these men were close friends, brothers in success, the kind of guys who had each other on speed dial. But then, Samuel L. Jackson sat down for an interview, and he dropped the correction heard around the world. When the interviewer brought up the yacht trip and asked about him and Steve vacationing together, Samuel didn't smile and play along. He didn't laugh it off. He didn't say, "Yeah, Steve's a great guy." He looked straight ahead and set the record straight. He explained that he and his wife were on their way to their own vacation spot. They got on their own boat with Magic and Cookie. Steve and Marjorie had their own boat. It was a coincidence, a random run-in, not a planned trip, not a friendship retreat, an accident. Now, pause here for a second. Think about how many celebrities get photographed together and just let the public believe whatever they want. Think about how many people in Hollywood would have smiled and said, "Oh yeah, Steve's great. We had an amazing time." Because what's the downside of letting people think you're cool with someone? There isn't one, unless you specifically do not want your name attached to that person. That's the part that matters. Samuel didn't stay quiet. He didn't let it slide. He made a deliberate, on-the-record correction. He went out of his way to say, "We were not together. We are not that close. Don't put us in the same sentence like that." And when a man of Samuel L. Jackson's stature and discipline does something like that, it means something. It means the idea of being associated with Steve Harvey bothered him enough to speak up about it publicly, which immediately makes you ask, why? What is it about Steve Harvey that Samuel L. Jackson refuses to be connected to? To understand that, you have to understand who these two men actually are, not the brand, not the persona, the real story. Two very different come-ups. Samuel L. Jackson's story is one of the most raw, real, and inspiring journeys in the history of entertainment. Full stop. He grew up without his father, raised by his mother and grandmother in the South. As a child, he had a severe stutter, the kind that got him mocked, ridiculed, laughed at by other kids every single day. And rather than let that define him, he used it as fuel. He pushed through it. He went to Morehouse College. He got involved in the civil rights movement while he was there. And not in a passive, background noise kind of way. He was active. He cared about something bigger than himself. Then he moved to New York, and for years, he hustled. Theater work, small roles, whatever he could find. He was sleeping on floors and stretching every dollar just to stay in the game. And during all of that, he was also battling something even harder: addiction. He hit rock bottom, the kind of rock bottom where people don't come back. But he did come back. He got clean, and he kept grinding. Even after he got clean, it still took years before Hollywood called. Spike Lee gave him his shot with Do the Right Thing and then Jungle Fever. But even then, he wasn't a household name. The world didn't know who Samuel L. Jackson was until Pulp Fiction, and by that point, he was already in his mid-40s. Let that sink in. Mid-40s. 2 decades of grinding, struggling, failing, rebuilding, and refusing to quit before the world finally caught up to what he already was. That's authenticity. That's a real story earned through real pain. Now let's talk about Steve Harvey's story, or more specifically, the story Steve Harvey told people. For years, Steve built his brand on a specific narrative. He was homeless, sleeping in his car for 3 years, washing up in gas station bathrooms, eating out of vending machines. It was powerful. It was moving. It became the backbone of his motivational speaking career, his books, his television persona. Millions of people connected with that story. It made him more than a comedian. It made him a symbol of survival. But here's where it gets complicated. Comedians who were actually there during Steve's early years, people who toured with him, shared stages with him, watched him up close, have come out and said that story doesn't match what they saw. Cat Williams said it directly and publicly. Steve Harvey was never homeless. Mark Curry, who toured with Steve around that time, has backed that up. He said when they were on the road together, Steve was making $3,000 a show, in cash. He had places to stay. He had people around him. The car, the gas station bathrooms, the vending machines, according to people from that world, was a story that got bigger and more dramatic every time it was told. And that matters. Not because hardship needs to be a competition, but because when your entire brand is built on a story of authenticity and survival, and then multiple eyewitnesses from that era say the story was heavily exaggerated, it raises a much larger question about what else has been manufactured. And then there's Cat Williams and the Detroit comedy battle. This is one of those stories that sounds almost too wild to be true, but multiple sources have confirmed it. Cat Williams and Steve Harvey went head-to-head in front of 10,000 people in Detroit. And according to Cat, who went into extensive detail about this on Club Shay Shay, he didn't just beat Steve that night, he destroyed him. And as part of the takedown, Cat pulled back the curtain on something Steve had been hiding. His signature high-top fade was a wig. Right there, in front of 10,000 people, the illusion came apart. Cat says that after that night, Steve never did stand up again. Steve's explanation has always been that he stopped because he had 7 TV shows and didn't need stand-up anymore. But Cat's timeline doesn't support that. He says those shows came after the battle, not before. He says Steve stopped because after that night, after being publicly exposed in front of a massive crowd, he couldn't go back on stage and tell personal stories that he knew weren't entirely his. Now ask yourself, does that change how you see the motivational speeches, the books about overcoming, the act like a success, think like a success empire? When the foundation of a persona is built on stories that people who were there dispute, everything built on top of that foundation deserves a second look. The stolen jokes, the receipts are out there. Now we get to the part of the story that really lit the internet on fire. And this one has video evidence. If you follow comedy at all, you've heard the accusations. Multiple comedians from Steve Harvey's era have said publicly, on podcasts, on camera, that Steve Harvey stole their material and used it as his own. But the loudest, most documented case is the one involving Mark Curry. Mark Curry, hanging with Mr. Cooper, has been saying for years that Steve took his jokes. Not inspired by, not a similar premise, took them, word for word. And one example became the defining piece of evidence. Mark had a bit from 1999, a personal story about growing up poor and how his family couldn't afford a real Halloween costume, so he had to wear a cardboard box. It wasn't just a joke, it was his life, a story from his childhood, told with his pain and his humor mixed together in a way that only comes from lived experience. That bit was his. Then Steve Harvey performed that same story, the same setup, the same emotional arc, the same punchline, on his nationally syndicated talk show, in front of millions of viewers, as if it had happened to him, his family, his costume, his story. When fans started putting the 2 clips side by side online, there was no debate, There was no gray area. The joke was the same joke, and the internet has a long memory. Mark confronted Steve about it, on camera, at the Def Comedy Jam 25th Anniversary Special in 2017. And the footage speaks for itself. Mark approaches Steve, and you can watch Steve's face change in real time. The comfort drains out of it. He looks like exactly what he is in that moment, a man who got caught, and it goes beyond Mark Curry. Cat Williams alleged on Club Shay Shay that Cedric the Entertainer, one of Steve's closest associates, one of the original kings of comedy, stole one of Cat's signature closing bits. According to Cat, Cedric came to the Comedy Store, sat in the audience, watched Cat do the joke, came up to him afterward and complimented him on it, and then used that joke almost word for word in the Kings of Comedy special. The only change? He swapped out the car in Cat's version for a spaceship. These are the men who called themselves the Kings of Comedy. They went on tour together. They made a film about it. They built their legacies on that brand. And all while calling themselves royalty, they were allegedly going to actual kings of the craft and taking the crowns off their heads. Let me ask you something directly, because I want you to think about this. If your entire public image is built around being authentic, relatable, and real, what does it say about you when the realness turns out to be borrowed? When the stories aren't yours, and the jokes aren't yours, and the struggle narrative is disputed by the people who were actually in the room? And Samuel L. Jackson, a man who genuinely lived a hard story, who genuinely fought his way up from nothing, watching someone use the concept of struggle as a marketing tool while surrounded by people who say the details weren't true, that's not something a man with Samuel's values can easily ignore. What happened to Bernie Mac? This is the section that really changes the temperature of the whole conversation, because everything before this, the yacht correction, the disputed origin stories, the joke stealing, you could arguably chalk up to pettiness, competition, the nature of Hollywood. But what allegedly happened to Bernie Mac? That's different. That's character. Bernie Mac was in a category by himself. Full stop. Anyone who saw him perform knows it. He had this raw, dangerous, electric presence on stage. He could make you laugh so hard you couldn't breathe, and then flip it into something that broke your heart, sometimes in the same sentence. Hollywood started to notice. Real directors, real producers, real roles. And according to Cat Williams, that's exactly what made Steve Harvey go to war with him behind the scenes. When Bernie Mac got cast in Ocean's 11, alongside Brad Pitt, George Clooney, Matt Damon, Julia Roberts, Cat says Steve Harvey went to the director and producers separately and offered to take the role for less money. He tried to undercut Bernie, to sneak behind the back of a man he was supposed to be in brotherhood with, a man he was touring with under the Kings of Comedy banner, and steal the role right out from under him, just to stop Bernie from having it. The producers said no. And then, they told Bernie what happened. Think about how that must have felt. You're Bernie Mac. You've earned this role. You've finally gotten your shot at the kind of film that could change your career. And the man standing next to you on stage, smiling in photos with you, calling himself your brother, went to the people who hired you and offered to do your job for less, not because he needed the money, but because he couldn't stand watching you succeed at something he wanted. DJ Ed Lover has backed this story up publicly. He said Bernie told him directly. Steve tried to take the Ocean's 11 role from him. This isn't one person speculating. This is multiple people saying they heard it from Bernie's own mouth while he was alive. And then Cat says the same energy was in play during the Kings of Comedy tour itself. When they were organizing the show order, Steve wanted the closing spot, because the closing spot is the headliner's position. That's the slot that says, this is who this night is really about. And the plan was to put Bernie in the opening slot, just warming up the crowd, the setup act, while Steve got to close and take all the glory. But when the producers watched the footage back, they couldn't do it. Bernie's set was operating on a completely different level from everyone else. So they did what the footage demanded. They moved Bernie to the closing spot. He earned it without even trying to, and Steve had to watch it happen. Bernie Mac passed away in 2008, and suddenly all these same comedians who were allegedly working against him were front and center with their grief. The tributes, the love, the he was my brother energy, from people who, according to Cat Williams and multiple others, had been trying to diminish him and undercut him for years. And this is where Samuel L. Jackson's disgust becomes completely understandable. Samuel was connected to Bernie Mac. They moved in the same circles. They worked together. They respected each other. Samuel knew what Bernie was, the real talent, the real deal. And if Samuel knew even a fraction of what allegedly went on behind the scenes, watching Steve Harvey monetize Bernie's memory after allegedly doing everything he could to steal from him and suppress him while he was alive, that's not something you forgive. That's not something you smile and take a yacht photo and let slide. That's character. And in Samuel's eyes, what allegedly happened to Bernie Mac tells you everything you need to know about Steve Harvey's, Lori, Diddy, and the dinner table. Now we get to the final piece of this puzzle. And honestly, when you add this to everything else, you understand why Samuel L. Jackson doesn't just dislike Steve Harvey. He reportedly finds him repugnant. Steve Harvey built an entire second career on being the authority on relationships and values. Act like a lady. Think like a man. The motivational speeches about what a real man looks like. The lectures on how a father is supposed to protect his family. It wasn't just content. It was a brand. And millions of people bought it, literally and figuratively. The book sold millions of copies. The talk show expanded. The persona of Steve Harvey, moral compass, became bigger than Steve Harvey, the comedian, ever was. So in 2019, when photos started surfacing of Steve's stepdaughter Lori Harvey hanging out with Diddy, the entire internet stopped. Because Lori had just been romantically linked to Diddy's son, Justin. And then suddenly she went from the son to the father. Diddy, who was more than twice her age at the time. Let that breathe for a moment, because it's important. This is the man who wrote a book on how men are supposed to behave. This is the man who built a television empire on the idea that if a man doesn't have standards, he has nothing. And here is his stepdaughter, someone he is supposed to be protecting, guiding, fathering, first linked to a young man's romantic circle, then pulled into the father's orbit, and the photos came out. Italy, Mexico, Atlanta. They were everywhere together, and Steve Harvey was in some of those photos, sitting at dinner, comfortable, smiling, looking at ease while his young stepdaughter sat next to a man old enough to be her grandfather's golf buddy. And he said nothing, not publicly, not privately, at least not in any way that anyone could see. He just sat there, at the table. Now, and this is critical, everything that has come out about Diddy since those photos puts them in a completely different light. The lawsuits, the allegations, the federal case, all of it. And people are going back to those dinner table photos with new eyes. They're looking at Steve Harvey sitting there, looking comfortable, and asking a question that doesn't have a good answer. What did he know? And when did he know it? Reports from industry insiders suggest Samuel L. Jackson was disgusted by all of it. And here's why that makes complete sense. Samuel has been married to LaTanya Richardson for over 40 years. 40 years in Hollywood, where relationships are disposable and temptation is everywhere. This man has been committed, faithful, and present. He knows what it actually looks like to protect your family, not as a talking point, not as a chapter in a book, but as a practice, a daily, unglamorous, real commitment. And watching Steve Harvey, who made millions of dollars telling the world what a real man and a real father looks like, sit at a dinner table with his stepdaughter, and a man whose behavior has since been documented in federal court documents without a word of concern, without a single public statement, without even the appearance of a man who actually lives by what he preaches. That is reportedly what pushed Samuel over the edge. That is what made him decide that the yacht correction wasn't just a minor clarification. It was a declaration. I am not this man. Do not put my name next to his. Do not put my family next to his. We are not the same. Putting it all together. Why this matters. So let's zoom out, because I want you to see the full picture clearly. Samuel L. Jackson made what looked like a small throwaway comment in an interview correcting a misconception about a vacation. That's it. On the surface, it's barely a story. But when you follow the thread, when you trace why a man of his caliber, his discipline, and his standing would go out of his way to make that correction, you end up here, looking at a pattern that stretches across decades. You've got a comedian who built his brand on a struggle narrative that multiple eyewitnesses dispute. You've got video-documented evidence of joke theft from a fellow comedian who earned those stories through lived experience. You've got allegations from multiple sources, backed up by people who heard it from Bernie Mac himself, of backstabbing a king of comedy for a movie role. You've got a man who branded himself as the authority on family values, sitting silently at dinner tables that, in hindsight, raise serious questions. And you've got a man who talks constantly about authenticity, whose entire persona, according to people from his own era, was constructed and performed rather than earned and lived. And on the other side of all of this, you have Samuel L. Jackson, who actually struggled, who actually hit rock bottom and clawed back from it, who actually spent 2 decades being broke and unknown before the world gave him what he'd already earned, who actually has the long marriage, the real loyalty, the career built on talent instead of persona management. When a man like that looks at a man like Steve Harvey and says, "We are not the same," he's not being petty, he's being precise. The question I want to leave you with is this. When someone's entire identity is based on a story of struggle, of values, of earned wisdom, and multiple people from that story say it doesn't match what they lived through, what do you do with everything built on top of it? The books, the speeches, the television advice, the moral authority. Does it hold up, or does the foundation matter? What do you think? I want to hear from you on this one, because this story genuinely divides people. There are people who will watch this and say Steve Harvey is a self-made success story, and that Cat Williams, who has his own baggage and controversies, is not a reliable narrator. There are people who will say joke borrowing in comedy has always existed and the line between inspiration and theft is blurry. There are people who will give Steve a pass on the Diddy situation and say a father can't control who his stepdaughter dates. And there are people who will watch all of this and feel exactly the way Samuel L. Jackson apparently feels, that the pattern is too consistent, too documented, and too personal to dismiss. So drop it in the comments right now. Do you think Samuel L. Jackson was right to publicly distance himself from Steve Harvey? Or is this all a case of people with grudges rewriting history? And here's the second question I want you to answer. Does the Lori and Diddy situation change how you see Steve Harvey's brand as a family values advisor? Because that's the one I keep coming back to. That's the thread that, when you pull it, unravels the most. Let me know. I read these. And if this story hit differently for you than you expected, that's because the yacht photo was never really about a yacht. It was about a man choosing, deliberately and publicly, to be honest about who he is not. And sometimes that kind of honesty is the loudest thing a person can say. Samuel L. Jackson has been in this business for over 4 decades. He has survived addiction, obscurity, failure, and Hollywood's most brutal rejection cycles. He earned every dollar, every role, and every ounce of respect he commands by refusing to cut corners, refuse to steal, and refusing to be something he wasn't. The yacht correction wasn't pettiness. It was principle. When you look at the stolen jokes with the video receipts, what allegedly happened to Bernie Mac behind closed doors, the kings of comedy backstabbing, and Steve's comfortable silence while his stepdaughter was in Diddy's orbit, you get a clear picture of why one of Hollywood's most respected voices made the deliberate choice to say, "Not me, not my name, not my family." And honestly, after everything you just heard, can you blame him? If this opened your eyes, share this video, drop a comment, subscribe if you haven't yet, because we go deep on these stories and we don't cut corners doing it. The next one is coming, and it connects to everything you just heard in ways you're not going to expect. Stay locked in.